Morning, Tom.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter to you. Glad you could join us.
Thank you. Thank you for putting this together.
Yeah. Me and Zoom, we're becoming close friends.
Yes, I'm learning that technology.
I'm going to go get myself something cold to drink. Hold on.
Hi, Sherry.
Hi, Sherry. We can't hear you.
Hello, we're unmuted now. We were talking.
Okay. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hi, everybody.
Thank you.
The Doubtings are out west.
Yes, we're at Bears Ears National Monument. And those are Bears Ears in the background.
And I have to admit people one by one now.
Oh, good morning.
Hi,
The
Genia.
Downings look like they're in the west. Isn't that fun?
Yes,
Sitting right in our own home.
I know.
Hi, Matt.
And
I love it.
Tom Evans has a mountain background, but
oh, Tom,
Oh,
I
Tom,
like-
look at that.
was that Banff or is that Canada?
That was in Wyoming.
Oh, good.
West
Jackson
of
Hole?
Laramie.
Laramie.
That's where I grew up.
really,
My son-in-law grew up there too, Tom. We'll have to talk about that.
Beautiful place.
Yeah.
Good morning, JS.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
morning, Tina.
I'm going to ask somebody to read the parable today. So is it too much to ask liberal Christians to try to find your Bible in your house?
I actually have one, believe it
I
or
have
not,
it right here.
but I didn't get it read ahead of time.
That's okay. We're going to read it together.
This one's really going to be hard, though.
Sounds a little sarcastic, Jeffrey.
No. Is it sarcasm or is it realism? I don't know.
I remember one time when the servants did a program in church, and Jane and Chuck, our children, were in this at that time. And they pulled out the Bible to read it and blew on it, and they had flour on it, so this huge cloud of dust came up.
Let's see. I'm still admitting people. So
Good.
don't turn anybody down. Bill Anderson is there. Bill
Hi,
has
Bill.
his Easter suit on.
Oh, Bill, look at
Hello,
that.
everybody.
Ah, he looks really sharp there.
Who has the nicest Easter bonnet? Nobody has a
I
bonnet?
don't think anybody does.
Jeffrey, thank you for trying to get me back on the email chain for the
Yeah.
church.
Yeah, is anybody else having trouble getting emails from the church? Not from me, but from the church.
No, I had some of the daily breads I got onto, and it said dangerous site. And then I went on through the website and it was fine. So I don't know what
Okay.
happened there.
Good, good.
I've checked my spam. It's not there.
Okay. Well, Dawn will help you, Marcy. We had this trouble with somebody else too this week, so you're not the only one. Well, good morning. Let's get started, folks. Oh, here's one more to admit. Jean Ebersole, should I admit her?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
I don't know.
Two thumbs up for Gene.
Hi, Jean, you made the cut. Admitted you. Hi. Hi, Jean.
I don't think she can
Just
hear
to
you.
turn her audio on.
Hi, Jean. Can you hear me?
She can't.
Oh, she's studying us.
Oh, she's connecting.
All right, good. Okay, I have a couple of announcements because it wouldn't be church otherwise. First of all, happy Easter, everybody. Christ is risen, Christ is risen indeed.
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 Indeed. Amongst and within and between and all around. we have two special upcoming evening programs, and one of them was in the messenger this week. It is the day after Earth Day, and that is, so Earth Day is Wednesday the 22nd, the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. Who was there in 1970 for the original?
I was.
I was.
And so the day after that is Thursday the 23rd. WCC with Kenilworth Union, Temple Jeremiah, and Church of the Holy Comforter is co-sponsoring an online educational event about recycling with a representative from SWANK. That's our local recycling agency. Swank, however you pronounce it. And that'll be at 7 o'clock. It's in the messenger. Have folks noticed that?
Not yet.
Not
Just-
yet. It's in the messenger.
I saw it.
You can register. I registered this morning. It was very simple and successful. And it'll be on Zoom, but you have to register to get the Zoom link. Something that has not been publicized yet, but is coming together the following week on Wednesday, the 29th. WCC Green Team will sponsor a community discussion about how the coronavirus crisis is affecting the climate for good, which is not to say that we're in favor of the crisis. It's just to take note that when economic activity significantly slows down, suddenly air quality, water quality, beach quality, land quality suddenly takes a positive turn. And we've found a nice little YouTube thing from Deutsche Welle Radio TV to show about that. So that's on Wednesday, the 29th at 7 o'clock. More information to come. Ready to look at parables?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so I looked at two parables and prepared two handouts, and I hope I can show them on screen share. I've never done that. So Lord help us with that.
Very easy.
Okay, good. I'm glad JS and maybe some others know how to do that. I think I just go to share screen
Yep.
and
you
I
have to
in
close
the
it.
document which I put on my desktop. So
Right.
okay, so I'm going to try that now. And I thought that of the two parables that I mentioned in the email, I thought we'd look at the laborers in the vineyard first, and that's Matthew 20, 1 through 16. And I will ask one of you to read it. Matthew 20, 1 to 16. Now let me try to screen share this document.
So fancy.
Oh, that's his screen. Oh, there we go.
Okay,
Very
Way to
good.
go, Jeffrey.
Good.
as JS said, it's really not difficult. It just seems like it when you've never done it before, right?
Once you learn something, it's easy.
So who would like to read the laborers in the vineyard? And if we get through this before 9:30, fine. We can go on to the other one. But if we only do one, that's okay too. Who's our reader?
You want us to read from there or from our Bibles?
No, I'm asking someone to read the passage.
Yeah.
Yep, from Matthew
Oh.
21 through 16.
How about if we share it? It's pretty long.
Okay,
I'll start with verses 1 and 2. Everybody ready?
Go for it.
For heaven's imperial rule is like a proprietor who went out the first thing in the morning to hire workers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the workers for a silver coin a day, he sent them into the vineyard.
When he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." So they went. When he went out again about noon and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about
447-446 3588. If you promise to vote only for pro-choice candidates, I promise to vote.
So we can hear somebody's background
Don't know who it is.
sounds.
You do?
Folks who are not speaking are invited to mute themselves. You can do that on the lower left hand of the screen by putting your cursor down there, and a pop-up menu will show up. Okay, where were we? Verse what?
We're at verse 6.
Okay, who can read verses, say, 6 and 7?
I'll be happy to read it. I'm Junior,
Thank you.
but I have a different Bible than
It's
the
okay,
others.
we're reading from different versions.
And about the 11th hour, he went out and found others standing. And he said to them, "Why do you stand here idle all day?" They said to him, "Because no one has hired us." He said to them, "You go into the vineyard too."
Okay, and 8 and 9?
And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his steward, "Can the laborers and call the laborers and pay them their wages, beginning with the last up to the first." And when those hired about the 11th hour came, each of them received a denarius.
Yes. And 10 and 11? Or
I'll pick up.
let's go through verse 12. 10
Okay.
through 12.
So when those who came were hired first, they expected to receive more, but each one of them also received a denarius. When they received it, they began to grumble against the landowner. "These men who were hired last worked only 1 hour," they said, "and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the work in the heat of the day."
And 13 to 16.
But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for a denarius? Take what belongs to you and go. I choose to give to this last as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or do you begrudge me my generosity? So the last will be first, and the first will be last."
Okay, so we are going to look at this Laborers in the Vineyard parable through the eyes of Amy Jill Levine and her book. Basically, what I've done in this handout is I've summarized her chapter on this parable. And we've got about 35 minutes, so let's take that time. If you want to ask any questions, make a comment, raise your hand by using one of the hand-raising emblems or icons at the bottom, or just shout out. Okay, so as we talked about last week, Amy Jill Levine her goal is to read parables, understand parables as they were originally understood by Jesus' first audience. That is Jewish residents of Palestine in the first century. She says what the church has done, and even the gospel writers themselves, is to allegorize them so that each character and aspect of the parable stands for something. And here she makes an interesting point that when the title, a common title, is given to the parable, that this leads to allegory. So this parable is commonly called The Laborers in the Vineyard. She said, even though she uses that title herself for her chapter, she says that's not a very good title because it lends itself to an easy allegory. Why? Because in Jewish literature, God is always understood as the landowner of a vineyard. This comes from the Old Testament, from Isaiah. So when Christians call it the laborers in the vineyard, then who is the landowner? Who is,
God.
No, it's
God is the landowner, right?
God.
So she would like us to think about how this parable would have been heard originally by Jesus' first audience. If we've already decided ahead of time that God is the landowner, sometimes called the householder, then we've already cast the vineyard in a certain light. She says, let's try to unhook ourselves from that assumption, because her quote here is, once allegory enters, the real world is left behind. She sees Jesus as a real world teacher, not a teacher about himself, not a teacher about how wicked the Jews are, not a teacher about heaven and hell, but a teacher about how people are to live together with one another in this world, in the here and now. How's that sound?
Good.
Right.
Well, but if the traditional way that Jews look at the vineyard is that God is the owner, how do you separate that, and why would Jesus separate that?
I share that same question.
Yeah, so later on in her analysis, she will say that, well, in a sense, maybe the vineyard is God. I mean, the landowner is God. So she doesn't completely unhook it or wish us to unhook it. And she does, as I mentioned, use this title for the title of her chapter. She just, her point is that when we title something, we are already casting it in a certain light. And the title, by the way, is not in the text. The title has been given to this parable and the other parables by tradition. So, for example, the parable of the prodigal son. Is it really about the prodigal son?
No.
Some say it's about the father. Some say it's really about the elder brother. So she suggests other titles for the parable of the prodigal son, such as the parable of the father who had two sons. When we put the focus on the prodigal son, the younger son, then we are already focused on him rather than focused on other characters. So she suggests other titles: the surprising salaries, the conscientious boss. But interestingly, again, she still uses the traditional title, and we'll get back to that. In part because verse 8 in the Greek, not necessarily in the New Revised Standard Version that I have before me, rather than in verse 8, where the Revised Standard Version says the owner of the vineyard, the Greek says the Lord of the vineyard. Now that could be Lord, capital L, or no L. There's no, there are no capital letters in Greek. But she says that the very fact that the Greek says the Lord of the vineyard suggests to an early Jewish audience that, well, I wasn't sure if the landowner was God or not, but maybe this is a kind of a divine figure. Or maybe if the landlord, the householder, is a divine figure, maybe that suggests how we ought to live our lives. So she does kind of connect those. So in her introduction, she goes on to say that if Jesus was a teacher about how we are to live with our neighbors today, then we can change the traditional theological focus of this passage from salvation in the future to salvation now. She makes the blunt claim here: Jesus was more interested in how we love our neighbor than how we get into heaven. Wow. That is not how this parable is usually heard, but she says that the first century Jewish audience would have heard it as something having to do with economics, basically.
Mm-hmm.
She says employment and labor relations. So, as she did last week, oh, by the way, I don't think I know how to, oh, here it is. Oh, I can move it. Yay!
Thank you.
Okay. So as we did last week, she sees anti-Jewish readings in these parables and understandings. So here it's not so much presented by Matthew as it is presented in the post-New Testament interpretation, the last 2,000 years of Christian interpretation. She says typically this parable is interpreted as the first hired workers are those stereotypically recalcitrant, always grumbling Jews who seek to be judged by their works. Do you hear some negativity here?
Yeah.
The last hired are the people who Jesus loved, the tax collectors, the outcasts. They don't keep the Jewish purity laws like those first hired, or they might be understood to be Gentiles who are brought to God not by works, but by grace. This is not only seeing this parable through Christian eyes, it's seeing the parable through Protestant eyes, because that's what Protestants are all about, salvation by grace and not by works. So her killer quote here is from John Wesley himself, the founder of Methodism. The primary scope of the parable is to show that many of the Jews would be rejected and many of the Gentiles accepted. Now, she does this throughout her book. Every parable, she uncovers the traditional anti-Jewish readings. She goes on to say that there are other unhelpful allegorical readings. By the way, she regards all allegorical readings as unhelpful. Here's one from the progressive wing of Christianity. This could be understood as a parable of affirmative action. The first hired are historically advantaged people, races, whites. Let's be blunt, okay? The last hired are ethnic and racial minorities. Now, Levine doesn't make this up. She actually researched tons of sermons preached recently on this parable. And she found lots of sermons preached from this perspective. Alternatively, the householder or landowner could be understood as a despot. That's actually a word that comes from the Greek for landowner or householder. So some interpreters take it as the landowner is not a positive figure, but a negative figure who has robbed the peasants of their land. I mean, using their imagination, some progressive interpreters may imagine that the landowner here is sending the peasants out onto his land, which used to be their land, but he stole from them. Get the picture? And the last hired are the expendables, whom the landowner is preventing from organizing with the others. So the reason he sends people out at different hours is to keep them separated from each other and not talking to each other so they won't unionize. How do you like that? Do you think that these interpreters are reading into the parable? Maybe?
Yes.
So in this view, the landowner pays the workers erratically, unevenly, unjustly, and arrogantly. The view is, I decide how much you get paid. You have no voice. Okay? And the last reading she also regards as unhelpful is still allegorical, and that is, it's a feminist reading where women identify with the first hired. Why do we get the same wage for working more? And women all around the world say, yes, why? Are any of these wrong or bad? And is the goal of these readings, are these improper goals? They might be laudable social goals, right? But Amy Jo Levine, who is herself a feminist and a progressive, says, this is not how Jesus' first audience would have heard them. Okay? She notes a couple problems with these interpretations. One is that day laborers in first century Palestine were not destitute. So a lot of these readings kind of depend on an understanding of what a day laborer in the first century would have lived like. And she said that a day laborer was actually doing pretty well because they were able to earn quite a good salary. A denarius, by the way, a denarius, if you can look at the text, the first note on the text toward the bottom of the page, a denarius would supply a family with 3 to 6 days of food. That's a very fair wage, isn't it? If you worked 5 days a week, 6 days a week, you were actually storing up enough value with those denarii so that you could see yourself through rainy days, right? So she says that sometimes when people read into the parable, they're not actually taking the historical context seriously or even into account at all. And lastly, she says that the parable does not say or suggest any of this. All these readings are allegorical. Before we launch into the text, sort of...
I have a question.
What are your questions?
Does the original Greek include the word denarius, or is it
Yes.
coin?
Yes, yes. One denarius for each worker, regardless of how many hours they worked. And a denarius then is her point is it's actually very fair. And that is a hint at how she thinks Jesus' first audience would have heard this parable. So she's very entertaining reading. If you can kind of wade through the details, you get to some very funny parts of her book. One of them is she says, the landowner is neither God the Father nor Godfather. By Godfather, she means kind of a mafioso figure who is trying to break the backs of the workers. Okay, that's what she means by that. The way the parable begins, nothing unusual happens until the 3rd hour. So some of the versions say 3rd hours and others say 9 o'clock in the morning. And she says that when the New Revised Standard Version translates the Greek agroi into other standing idle, she says really it means those without work. And hear the difference between those two phrases. What do those two phrases mean to you? Other standing idle versus those without work.
The first implies sort of laziness.
Yeah.
Sure. And the latter means, give me some work. I'm ready to work.
Exactly.
And the capitalists.
Exactly. So she says the proper translation is those without work. So keep that in mind too. These were just people who had come for work and they didn't have work. So starting page 2 of the handout, the landowner is not taking advantage of them by not offering a contract. If you read the text, it says somewhere, he says, I will pay you a fair wage, right? So those who read this from a progressive side say, aha, he's not even coming to an agreement with them. He's basically saying, trust me, I'll pay you fairly. Her argument is that the landowner is not really taking advantage of them, that this was common, and that everybody knew that the daily wage was a denarius. And they had every right to expect that they would be paid a denarius, which is a fair living wage. She uses the phrase living wage, which is a common political term today, I know. So things become stranger in the 6th and 9th hour, that is noon and 3, because the landowner is still going to the marketplace, still sending people out. And then very strange, at the 11th hour, which is 5 o'clock, why would you go to the marketplace and find day laborers and send them out for only an hour or 2? So the question is, why does he do so? Is he a poor labor manager and he doesn't know how much labor he needs? Maybe. Or she suggests, is it something else? Does he have a more beneficent motive? This is what she's suggesting. She says the parable says nothing about the need for more labor. The other question is, why are these laborers arriving so late? Are they lazy? Or she suggests maybe they've already finished another job
Mhm.
and they're coming for essentially a second shift at another job. Or maybe they couldn't come early in the morning because they had their older parents or children or people with disabilities at home to take care of. And that's why they're showing up. And when they say in verse 7, no one has hired us, she hears Jesus really saying, but someone should have hired them. So do you see where this interpretation is going? And here again, where she kind of uses this idea of the Lord of the vineyard. In verse 8, the Lord of the vineyard could maybe mean God, which is why I think she probably keeps the traditional title for her chapter title. She says, the Lord behaves unexpectedly. And when characters in stories and in the Bible behave unexpectedly, we suspect that maybe God is at work here. And if it's not God, then maybe we should behave in an unexpected manner, which is the way God behaves. For example, in Exodus, when God intervenes to save not the powerful, but the powerless. So let's move along to the conclusion of the story where the first hired come in and they complain. What are they complaining about? They say they want what is fair, but the landowner instead shows them what is right. What's the difference between fair and right?
Jeffrey, I don't know if this applies in all cases between fair and right, but in this one moment, the fair is very focused on the moment, the now, and a little bit backward looking over the course of the day. And the landowner's point of view is bigger. It's more conceptual. It is, you could say, fair in a bigger picture, as opposed to fair of the detail of just tabulating hours and dollars. Very detail focused. But the version of right that the landowner puts out is thinking more of what should have happened, not what did happen. And it's just a bigger point of view. It's not less fair.
So it's not all the workers who are claiming you're not treating us fairly. Which workers is it?
The all-day workers, the early workers.
Right, the early workers see it as, quote, unfair. The landowner, yeah, as Sherry points out, the landowner takes this as an opportunity to demonstrate, by giving everybody the same wage, to demonstrate what's right, that there's something even a higher ethical standard than fairness is making sure that everybody has enough food to eat. That's where she's going with this.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that the first hired do not take their complaints to their union steward, and neither do they take their complaints to the other workers. They take their complaints to the landowner because they know that in public, they actually have nothing to gripe about. He promised them a fair wage. He's giving them a fair wage. They could have said, oh, look how generous you are being to everybody. Thank you. But instead, they are concerned only about who?
Themselves.
They're not concerned about their co-workers who came a little bit later, but who need to eat as much as they need to eat. So
They may be concerned, kind of on this lower level that Sherry was talking about. They may be concerned about what they perceive as fair and just, but they're not quite up to the next level yet.
Yep.
So maybe they need to be educated, which is what happens.
Yep. So Levine's really making her point when she says, by the way, these are kind of quotes from the text, maybe not exactly from her text, from Levine's text. She says, the first hired do not want to be treated equally to the last hired. They want to be treated better. And when the landowner says in verse 13, I am doing you no wrong, she again appeals to the original language. And she said, really what it means is more positively, I have treated you justly. Likewise, verse 4, when the landowner says, I will pay you whatever is right, she hears in verse 13 an echo of verse 4. In other words, the landowner has kept faith with everybody. It's the grumbling workers who are only concerned about themselves and nobody else. They are not keeping covenant. So she sees this as through the ancient Israelite theological category of covenant. The landowner keeps covenant. The grumbling workers do not keep covenant. Because what's a covenant? A covenant says when we are all in this together, as we're saying right now about the COVID crisis. We are all in it together. The grumbling workers are only in it for themselves.
Mhm.
And by the way, verse 16, she says that Matthew and maybe Luke and Mark also often take a word or phrase in a parable, and then they attach this floater verse that the last shall be first and the first shall be last. This is common, she says, in the Gospels. Jesus probably did say, first shall be last and last but shall not be first. Or sorry, first shall be last and last shall be first. But she says it really doesn't apply in this parable. And she says, therefore, it's not the moral of the story. Now, to getting then more specifically to the meaning of the original parable, she quotes B.H. Young, the laborers should have been happy about the good fortune of their co-workers, who because of the generosity of the landowner would now have enough provision for their families. The last hired benefit from an employer who is generous with his money. In the end, all have enough to eat. So it's not a parable unless it provokes us. Is anyone provoked yet?
Yep.
Yes. Yes.
She says, here's where the surprise is. The surprise is maybe the parable has to do with economics, not with heaven, not with Jesus, not with how recalcitrant the Jews are. And she says this is consistent with Jesus' teachings throughout the Gospels. Jesus has more to say, about treating people fairly when it comes to food and money than about sex or any other topic. Jesus seems to be solely focused on human welfare in its most primal sense of healing and making sure that everybody has enough to eat. She says maybe what we should do as we read this parable, a proper response is to make sure that everyone has enough food. And she gives some examples of other stories like this parable that are told by Josephus regarding the building of the Second Temple in 1 Samuel 30, and then after the time of Jesus in Rabbinic Judaism. Apparently this kind of story was pretty popular, and the point was always the same. Let's make sure that everybody has enough to eat. And then to JS's earlier question, perhaps the landowner is both analogous to God and a model for followers of Jesus. Does that make this interpretation an allegory, or is the landowner simply analogous to God? Or what's the difference between an analog and an allegory? I don't know. She says, furthermore, dismissing the parable's practical implication is to make it safe and to lose its challenge. And again, her conclusion is what is right is a living wage. The equality of his payments and his treating all the workers equally derives from a sense of justice keyed into what people need to live. Final points. The point is not that those who have get more, but those who have not get enough. Or perhaps one works in the labor force or in the kingdom, not for reward or more reward, but for the benefit of all. It encourages householders to support laborers, all of them. The point is practical, edgy, and a greater challenge to the church. God's concern is that we enter the kingdom now, not who enters it, Christian versus Jew or Christian versus non-believer. Okay, are you provoked?
Not really.
Oh, yeah.
Not really?
I am, because, you know, we have examples of this in our workforce, where those people who are paid hourly and those who are paid a salary. And somehow there is a presumption that those who are paid a salary are better than those who are only paid an hourly wage. So I think we have lots of examples of somewhat, you know, how these kind of statements and classifications can lead to inequity.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Chuck. I'm provoked twice, I think. First on this economic level, because right now, April 2020, we're being asked to reconsider, I think what Milton Friedman said, the only reason to go into business is profit. There's no community, just make a profit. So there's the economic argument, but also this whole book, and I've yet to finish it, but are we only to look at Jesus's words as what he meant when he was speaking to the people that he was speaking to then, that year? Or was he divine enough to know that his words were supposed to be heard by the whole world someday, maybe? I don't want to I get her point that, allegory limits things. But I'm gonna, maybe we could read Jesus's words, his quoted language in two ways.
Well, it's interesting, she's presenting her ideas as someone who does not believe in Jesus as a divine figure. And yet she says throughout her book that, believe in Jesus as a divine figure or not, his wisdom seems to be timeless.
Right.
Well, or the human condition is timeless in terms of the way we treat each other or live our life.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's probably a higher ethical standard than the one we currently embrace.
What it says to me is everybody reads into these parables what they want to be reading into, whether they have the advantage of information about what life was like at the time of Jesus or not. Everybody reads into the parables what they feel that is appropriate for them. And sometimes it's manipulative and sometimes it's not. And so nothing provokes me in these stories because everybody has a choice as to how they want to interpret them. So if someone interprets them differently from me, that's fine. That's their choice. So I guess it doesn't provoke me for that reason.
So let's take Levine's thesis and play it out a little bit. Let's say that Jesus told these parables in their original form the way she suggests, or something close to that. What does it say about the church that in 2,000 years of interpretation, we have spiritualized them, made them about heaven and hell, who's in and out of the church, and about the divinity of Jesus, rather than trying to recover their challenging moral edge? What does that say about Christian theology and the church?
To me, to me, it seems like studying what these stories mean ethically and morally, that's a lot harder work than going to church and hearing who's, what you have to do, and everybody's going to be, as long as you accept Jesus, you'll get into heaven. That's in a way more, unbelievable and storytelling than his stories. His stories were true. I mean, I like the way you've historically interpreted this, or put it in the historical context, because it's an essence of truth that is timeless. And you don't get that in church services unless you delve into it like this.
One theory is that the church was so eager to establish itself in the ancient Roman world that it started to take the edge off of some of Jesus' very blunt comments about the rich and the poor and spiritualize them. Because you don't get started as a world religion by thumbing your nose at the Roman Empire. You have to come to some kind of accommodation with the empire. But once you start to accommodate yourself to the forces of the empire, when does that stop? And some say it built up from the time of the gospel writers all the way to Constantine in the 4th century, when Constantine threw in the towel completely and said, Christianity is now the religion of the empire. And Jesus had gone from a provocative teacher to the Son of God. Because, again, Son of God becomes a theory, not a theory, but a belief to believe in your head, rather than a teacher who provokes us to selfless living for the sake of others. That's one way of reading this trajectory of history. And a lot of biblical interpreters say it didn't just start with Constantine, it actually started with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
And then it went.
And Paul. And this spiritualizing dimension of Christianity kind of took over the church. And so Jesus is not quite the radical today that he probably was in his day. I mean, he got crucified for something.
You're saying he's somewhat like Bernie Sanders?
As Jesus said to Judas, you have said so.
But that's helpful, because then the church after Constantine gradually went in, excuse me, I haven't talked to anybody this morning, into the Holy Roman Empire and all of the things that they did with the Inquisition and the power structure and so forth that happened then. Not paying attention to the real people, the workers and so forth.
I think the church fell into the need for an enemy very early. And who was the enemy? It wasn't the Roman Empire. Who was the enemy of the early church through today?
The Jews.
The Jews.
The Jews.
There's, Christian anti-Semitism didn't start with Luther or Hitler. It has ancient roots.
Wow.
Ancient roots. And this is one way to build up your group, is by setting it up as opposed to the other group.
Yeah.
And the Jews have always been the evil other in the church. And she does a good job of helping us understand how the parables cannot possibly be understood that way. And any interpretation in that direction tells us more about the early church and the later church's views of the Jews rather than what Jesus thought of the Jews. Jesus was a Jew. He did not have a negative assessment of his own religion.
Oh, I would disagree.
Go ahead.
I mean, there are places where he condemns or speaks very sharply about people of prominence within his own religion.
Right, and that could be understood not as rejecting his own faith, which is how Christianity has traditionally taught it, but rather as having a lover's quarrel within one's own tradition. So if you love your tradition enough, you will eventually pick a fight with it. And Jesus certainly had disagreements with the religious leaders of his day, but not with his religion.
He wanted to make it better.
He wanted to make it better. It's better to understand Jesus as a reformer rather than a rebel who sought to overthrow his religion.
Well, he wanted to make it better in his eyes, which may not necessarily be the view of other people within the religion. They would disagree with him.
Yeah, and I
the
think that's
Bible doesn't speak to everybody sitting down and having a conversation about that. We only get Jesus's side.
Yeah, I think Jesus probably understood himself within the prophetic tradition of Judaism. The prophets were always reformers, and I think probably in his mind, Jesus probably thought he was a prophet kind of figure who was always trying to recapture the most important values of the faith and make them live again for today. And Jesus saw the Judaism of his day as having gone astray, and that his was a voice to bring it back to where it should be, which is a lot different than saying, I'm here to start a new church, a new religion altogether. Because yes, Jesus has a lot of negative things to say about the religious leaders and is eventually turned in by those who are complicit with the Roman government, with the Roman Empire.
Well, that's what he saw himself as, and others would have disagreed. And there's nothing in the Bible that allows us to get the other people's point of view and have a conversation and a dialogue with people with whom you disagree, which is part of this whole exercise.
That's true. We don't really get the point of view of those who didn't like Jesus' message, or even the average Jewish peasant in Galilee. Their voices are not included in the New Testament, are they? We are at our time. We didn't get to the parable of the kingdom of heaven is like yeast, but I'll be glad to send you the handout on that if you'd like.
Please.
Yes.
Oh, please do.
It's shorter, but the parable is only one verse. So thank you all for your time today.
Thank you for doing this for us today.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
It was great, Jeffrey. Thank you. Happy Easter, everybody.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
Happy Easter, everybody.
Happy Easter.
Be well. See you at 10 o'clock. Okay.
That's right.
Yes.
Thank you.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. Bye.
Thanks, Jeffrey.